It was a cold February morning, and Baker Street lay under a thin blanket of snow. The fire crackled in our sitting room as I, Dr. John Watson, sat reading the morning paper. Across from me, Sherlock Holmes lounged in his chair, a pipe in hand, his piercing gaze fixed on the ceiling. Holmes had been in a rare mood of restlessness for days, the absence of an engaging case leaving him discontent. "Watson," Holmes remarked suddenly, "do you ever wonder how many lives unfold in secrecy, hidden behind veils both literal and figurative?" Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson entered, announcing a visitor. A woman, heavily veiled, was ushered into the room. She was petite, her black attire marking her as a widow. Her gloved hands trembled as she sat before us, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Holmes," she began, "I am Mrs. Eleanor Greaves. I have come to you in desperation. I fear my late husband's death was not an accident, as the authorities claim, but murder." Holmes leaned forward, his sharp eyes studying her through the veil. "Murder, you say? Pray, tell me everything, Mrs. Greaves, and leave nothing out." "My husband, Frederick Greaves, was a wealthy merchant," she began. "He owned an estate in Surrey, where we lived for many years. Frederick was a reserved man, devoted to his work and to me. 3 months ago, he fell to his death from the balcony of his study. The police concluded it was a tragic accident." She paused, her voice catching. "But I do not believe it was an accident. Frederick was cautious, meticulous. He would never have leaned too far over that railing. Moreover, in the weeks before his death, he became paranoid, claiming that someone was following him." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Did he name anyone he suspected?" She shook her head. "No, but he grew secretive, locking himself in his study for hours. I overheard him arguing with someone on the telephone once, but when I asked, he dismissed it." "Did you find anything unusual after his death?" Holmes asked. Eleanor hesitated before replying. "I found a torn page in his study, part of a letter. It mentioned something called the Marchand Agreement. I don't know what it means, but I believe it is the key to his death." She produced the fragment, handing it to Holmes. He examined it closely, his expression unreadable. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Watson, prepare yourself. We depart for Surrey at once." The Greaves estate was a sprawling manor surrounded by frost-covered fields. Eleanor led us to Frederick's study, a grand room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a mahogany desk. The balcony door stood open, revealing the iron railing where Frederick had fallen. Holmes moved with purpose, examining the desk, the carpet, and the balcony. He paused by the railing, his fingers brushing its surface. "This railing was tampered with," he said. "The screws are loose, and the marks suggest they were deliberately removed and hastily replaced." I joined him, peering over the edge to the ground below. "Could it have been sabotage?" "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied. "But by whom? That is the question." Inside, he turned his attention to the desk. Papers were neatly arranged, but Holmes's keen eye caught something out of place. A drawer, slightly ajar, revealed a hidden compartment. Inside was a ledger, its pages filled with coded entries. "A cipher," Holmes remarked, his lips curling into a faint smile. "It appears Frederick Greaves was involved in something far more complex than simple trade." As we pored over the ledger, Eleanor entered, her face pale. "I just remembered something," she said. "A man named Victor Marchand visited Frederick several times before his death. I believe he is connected to this agreement." "Victor Marchand," Holmes mused. "The name is familiar. A financier, if I recall correctly." Holmes wasted no time. He sent a telegram to Mycroft Holmes, his brother, requesting information on Marchand. By the next morning, a reply arrived, revealing that Marchand was under investigation for fraudulent schemes and connections to a smuggling ring. "It seems Frederick Greaves stumbled into dangerous territory," Holmes said. "We must locate Marchand. Watson, accompany me to his address in London." In London, Holmes and I arrived at Marchand's townhouse, a stately building with curtains drawn tight. Holmes rapped sharply on the door. After a long pause, a butler answered, his expression wary. "Mr. Marchand is unavailable," he said. Holmes's eyes glinted. "Inform him that Sherlock Holmes wishes to speak with him regarding the death of Frederick Greaves." The butler hesitated, but eventually admitted us. We were led to a study where Victor Marchand awaited. He was a tall man with piercing eyes and an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice smooth, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Holmes wasted no time. Frederick Greaves was murdered, and his death is connected to the Marchand agreement. I suggest you start talking. Marchand's composure faltered for a moment before he laughed. "Murdered? Ridiculous. Greaves and I had a business arrangement, nothing more." "And this arrangement involved smuggling contraband, did it not?" Holmes pressed. Marchand's smile vanished. "You have no proof." Holmes produced the ledger. "This, combined with your reputation, paints a damning picture. If you do not cooperate, I will ensure Scotland Yard investigates every detail." Marchand sighed, his bravado crumbling. "Greaves discovered the smuggling operation," he admitted. "He threatened to expose us unless we disbanded. My associates wanted him silenced, but I told them it was too risky. And yet, he is dead," Holmes said coldly. "Who carried out the act?" Marchand hesitated. "A man named Conrad Blackthorn. He works for the organization. If anyone tampered with the railing, it was him." Armed with Marchand's confession, Holmes tracked Blackthorn to a dockside warehouse in the East End of London. The air was thick with the smell of salt and coal as we approached the building, its windows dark and foreboding. Inside, crates were stacked high, and shadows danced in the dim light. Blackthorn, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, stood over a ledger, flanked by two accomplices. Holmes stepped forward, his voice ringing out. "Conrad Blackthorn, you are under suspicion of murder." Blackthorn sneered, drawing a pistol. "You should have stayed out of this, Holmes." Before he could act, I fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the warehouse, startling Blackthorn's accomplices. In the chaos, Holmes lunged forward, disarming Blackthorn with a swift motion. The other men fled, leaving their leader at our mercy. Back at Baker Street, Holmes reflected on the case. The threads of greed and betrayal wove a web that ensnared Frederick Greaves. His discovery of the smuggling operation made him a target. Blackthorn may have carried out the deed, but Marchand's cowardice allowed it to happen. "What of Eleanor?" I asked. "Mrs. Greaves can rest knowing her suspicions were justified," Holmes replied. "The truth, as always, has prevailed." And so concluded another case in the remarkable chronicles of Sherlock Holmes, a tale of ambition, deception, and the relentless pursuit of justice.